Okay, going back to evaluating our research design, there are two critical things we need to consider. The internal validity of the study. So did the study answer the research questions and provide credible evidence? And the external validity. Can the findings be generalized or transferred outside of the study? A general rule: the fewer the alternative explanations, the greater the internal validity of the experiment. So we need to think about controlling for variability. The fewer the alternative explanations, the stronger the experiment, the greater the internal validity. Did the study answer the research questions and provide credible evidence? With quantitative designs, remember numbers, empirical, experimental research, was the variance controlled appropriately to provide an uncontaminated picture of the relationship between the independent variable and the dependent variable? Uncontaminated picture between the independent variable and the dependent variable. In an experiment lacking internal validity, we do not know whether the experimental treatment or uncontrolled factors produce the difference between or within groups. So there are a number of threats to internal validity that could affect our ability to believe in the results. The first that we're going to talk about is the Hawthorne effect, and this is called an observer effect. It's a phenomenon whereby workers improve or modify an aspect of their behavior in response to the fact of the change in their environment rather than in response to the nature of the change itself. It doesn't have to be workers. So subjective performance is altered by an awareness that they're being observed. So in the example that we're going to watch, the researchers wanted to look at lighting in a factory, and what they found was that it wasn't the lighting that made a difference in output and performance. It was the fact that the workers knew they were being observed, so they're being watched. So they're going to work harder while the boss is watching them. It wasn't the fact that the lights were changed. It was that researchers were watching them. So subject performance is altered by an awareness that they're being observed. To overcome the Hawthorne effect, you could communicate clearly the purpose of the study. So we're studying lighting right now. You could take multiple measures. So if the effects are only short-term, monitor the performance frequently to ensure the gains are real. So if you were watching the workers 24/7, at some point, they're going to bring it down a notch. And measure the outside awareness of the participants. Another threat to internal validity is the Rosenthal effect. This is the influence of the experimenter's expectations on the part of the participants, intentionally or unintentionally. For example, a mother will be more interactive with her child during story reading if she thinks that's what the expectation of the experimenter is. So, I could be talking to a mother like, oh, I'm sure you read to your child every night. I'm just going to watch you. I'm going to observe you for about 3 hours and, take some notes on how the child is interacting with its siblings. And the mother has it in her head like, oh, wait, the researcher expects that I read a lot, so I'm going to make sure I read a lot in front of him. So the influence of the experimenter's expectations. Other threats to internal validity that we're going to talk about are history, maturation, attrition, differential subject selection, repeated testing effects, instrumentality, mortality, differential attrition, regression to the mean, and experimental bias. History: events that occur outside the experiment, between two measurements, or outside the control of the experimenter. For example, studying a dyslexia treatment at school, but of the 5 kids you're studying, 1 is also getting private tutoring at home. So that's a threat to your internal validity because one of the children you're looking at is getting additional dyslexia treatment after school. In this instance, the experimenter cannot determine whether the result is a function of the extraneous events alone, the extraneous events interacting with the experimental treatment, or the experimental treatment alone. Another example is maturation, changes within the subject themselves that may have an influence in the results of the experiment. This also can't be controlled by the experimenter. So any sort of age changes, changes in biological or physiological processes that take place over time. This could be a problem in longitudinal studies. Long-term treatment research makes people more susceptible to maturation effects. I have an example when my son started in daycare in one of his classrooms. He was like a year and 10 months, right? And he was one of the younger ones in this group. And his language skills weren't as strong as the older kids in the group. So his teacher, Miss Jen, would comment on how he wasn't, at the same level as the other kids. And then in June, when he was like 2 years and 10 months, Miss Jen said something like, "Oh, he's come a long way. Like his language skills have come a long way." And it was, her doing. And I wanted to say, Miss Jen, and it's nothing to do with you. It's the fact that he's matured in the last 11 months. There have been developmental changes in 11 months in his language abilities that had nothing to do with, school or you or even me necessarily. Attrition is subject experimental mortality. This is the differential loss of subjects between comparison groups. This is also an issue for longitudinal studies. It could be that, a subject passes away, or it could be that they just sort of decide they don't want to participate in the study anymore and they just disappear. So for survey results, at least a 50% response rate is considered minimally adequate with these sort of subject attrition. If all your subject drops out, you don't have a valid study. If too many drop out, especially with longitudinal, this can be a problem. Differential subject selection. The absence of equality prior to experimental treatment poses a threat. So differences between the subjects in the experimental and the control group may account for treatment effects rather than the treatment itself. You again need to make sure that your control group and your experimental group are equal on variables, that there's subject randomization, so that again, that your treatment is having an effect or not having an effect, that it's not a function of the subjects themselves. Repeated testing effects or reactive pretests. So merely having been tested before will affect the performance on the same or similar tests. So even taking like a standardized test, the more you take it, the more familiar you become with it, the less anxiety there is to it. So that's a reactive pretest. When I was younger, in like the 80s, I'm positive we were only tested once a year in like March or April, the Iowa test, once a year. And it was to avoid getting us familiar with it so they could get more like a true picture of where we were at. But now, I don't know if I'm right or wrong, but because there's such high stakes testing, a lot of times the teachers are teaching the test for the students. The students take practice tests, and it's this idea that the more you take it, the more familiar you become, the less anxious you become about it. So anytime a pretreatment is used, the reader must ask whether the post-treatment changes are due to the treatment effects, testing effects, or a combination of the two. One solution to this is to have a control group without treatment or a non-reactive measure. For example, a language sample. For school grades, reading improvements, collect a list of books that the children have been reading. So something to avoid that test, pre-test. Instrumentation is another form of internal validity. So faulty, inadequate, or fluctuating calibration used in an experiment, it doesn't work. So before every test, you calibrate your equipment. You make sure your equipment's working, because You have to know that the equipment, that the data you collect from one equipment is the same as it is from on one patient, is the same data with the same calibration measuring the same thing on the other patient. So ongoing monitoring is very important. Also, rating scales, questionnaires, inventories, standardized language tests, they're also important instruments. And they're standardized. They're tested on, hundreds or thousands of people before they become a standard test. A poor pencil and paper test, one that has not been standardized, one that has inadequate reliability, or one that was standardized on a sample different from that under investigation, can have serious consequences. So you can't just make up your own test and then come to big conclusions on your own test that's been tested on just, a handful of people and not vetted by other researchers and clinicians on thousands of people. Good questionnaire development is a very complex task. One not, you can't just come up with it on your own. Same thing with different instruments that are used. If you use a sensor net on one group of subjects, you use the same net on another group. You should be using the same room settings, the same research assistants to collect the data. Everything should be the same, right? And this all goes in the methods section so that you can be sure your results are a function of the actual independent variables and not poor design. Another threat is regression to the mean. This is, let's say it's taking people with the poorest scores and using them in your study. Then, if they're at the bottom, they have nowhere to go but up from your treatment. Or if you take people at the very top, they have nowhere to go but down. So extreme scores on earlier tests could influence the results on other tests. In this phenomenon, subjects are selected on the basis of atypically low or atypically high scores so that their new scores are now somewhat better or somewhat poorer than they were originally. Usually, it's just choosing very weak, you choose a very weak group of students and give them intensive training that you designed, and then, there's going to be an improvement. But if you gave the same training to average or stronger students, would there still be a huge jump or a huge improvement in scores? It was just that you took individuals that had nowhere to go but up. So they're all headed to the mean, to the middle. Investigators may conclude that the treatment produced the change when in reality the scores have simply moved or regressed towards the middle, the mean score, and the other scores have become less atypical. And again, it goes back to your subject selection. So it could have just been that your atypical scores would have even improved without treatment. They would have gotten better over time anyway, just because the kids are in school in the first place and they're going through the programs. Experimental bias. This is where a researcher may treat the data differently due to his or her own biases or their own perspectives. So a researcher might be more likely to score children with hearing loss lower than children with their hearing peers on perception of speech, just because they have their own biases. Double blindness technique or cross-checking against bias can help fix this problem. So bringing in other researchers and blinding the data and having other researchers or clinicians rate the data can help get rid of the experimental bias. So again, it's like awareness. Good to have redundancy and cross-checking. I think a final threat, we're almost at the end, are interaction effects. For example, younger age groups will have larger developmental effects. Older age groups will have larger attrition. It's impossible that these interaction effects, 2 or more, are previously described. So we could have more than one of these internal validity issues coming up. And it's hard, again, to control for everything. But pretty much like the tighter your internal design is, the stronger the study. But the harder it is, it makes external validity, which we'll talk about next.